Okay, I was just talking about Robert Venturi, complexity and contradiction in architecture, and learning from Las Vegas, and the duck and the decorated shed. So all those things are now, by the way, postmodern. We have entered the era of postmodernism. Venturi is usually a kind of hallmark of ushering in this era of postmodern. And the Guild House is a building that Venturi is the architect of. So he's not just a theorist, he's also a designer. And the Guild House, if you really just stop and stare at it for a little while, is not meant to be stunning architectural and something kind of gorgeous that you have every desire to live in. If you really stare at the Guild House, it's kind of ugly. It looks pretty banal, looks very average, not particularly enticing. The signage in front of it is very large, kind of tacky almost. This is all on purpose. And Venturi is making fun of architecture in a way. He's creating a sarcastic architecture that has a sense of humor to it. And he's really making fun of the state of architecture in the US and the fact that this is what a lot of buildings look like. This is supposed to be actually an apartment building for senior citizens. I think it's in Philadelphia. But you wouldn't want to live here. I wouldn't want to live here. It looks depressing, really. And this is all on purpose, which I find pretty funny. So there are a couple telltale signs here that this is actually Robert Venturi and has actually been designed by an architect. The little kind of slits in the brick facade here, those are Venturi types of details. This large, very large arc window is also a Venturi detail. If you really look at that, that's kind of custom and not something that you see all the time. But the symmetry, the organization to it, even the kind of small windows that exist over here that are these little ribbons, all that stuff he's doing on purpose. The signage here that says Guild House is meant to be kind of awkwardly sized and too large for the space and sort of in your face. And then a couple of the things that he does here on purpose, which are jokes or part of his sense of humor, is to create this TV. If you probably can't even notice, but this TV antenna right here, which is actually on top of the building, that's not real. It doesn't need to be there. It's not actually for service to televisions. It's just an ornament, right? So he's using that as an architectural detail in a kind of cheeky, joking way of like, oh, this ugly thing. These are the things that end up happening to buildings, right? You couldn't imagine a Mies van der Rohe house with like a DirecTV satellite dish on the roof. It would just be outrageous, but kind of funny. And this is the point that Venturi's trying to make. Like the way people actually live in buildings and the way buildings are used take on a whole new life. And even these vertical blinds, that's Venturi on purpose, showing this utterly, they're oversized actually, they're kind of out of scale, but meant to be very visually prominent and degrade the exterior look of the space. So Venturi's playing with your mind here, and this is signature Venturi, and this is a good introduction to postmodernism. So some of the principles or tenets of postmodernism deal with meaning and narrative, and I would say that is the primary goal of a lot of postmodernist architecture is to either tell a story, reference some sort of narrative or story, and have meaning. So they care about the meaning of the building, maybe what it meant before, if it's referencing something else, or what it means now. And so one example of meaning is the next Venturi project I'm going to show you here, which is a house that Robert Venturi creates for his mother. This is the Vanna Venturi house, and this is Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania. This is 1962. And so he creates this house for his mom. I'm going to have to try to explain this to you. Usually in class I'll draw something on the board. But he creates this house for his mom as almost as a social commentary. And the way that we look at this house in class, we don't look at the floor plan necessarily, don't look at the interior space, the function, the experience, the lighting, the things that you guys are trained to pay attention to, and that myself included, and that you and that most people use to evaluate architectural spaces don't apply here. So the aesthetics, the lighting, the experience, the feeling you have when you're inside of it, the materials, Venturi's not paying attention to any of that. What he's doing is actually making a social commentary. A kind of story is being told with this building facade in particular. And he is essentially destabilizing our almost inherent childhood notions about architecture. So you have to think with me for a minute. When you're a kid and you sit down and you draw a house, I'm just going to kind of map it here with my mouse, but you draw a little house that has like a little square box for the building, has a triangle or a gabled roof, and then it has a door and 2 windows or maybe 4 windows or something. That's the house, right? When you're a kid and you learn to draw a picture, that's the house you draw. And psychologically, this is a statistic that is surprising and true. This is what all children draw, no matter where they live or what they live in. So if I'm a child and I live in a high-rise apartment building in Manhattan, I still sit down and draw that house as my house. And that's because that's the kind of cartoon image of a house that you see, that you recognize, that you understand. It's the symbol or the icon of what a house means. And so Venturi is thinking about this, aware of it, and I think so smart in how he approaches the design of this house. This is his house, theoretically, right? It's his mom's house, but he is creating a commentary of kind of breaking apart that understanding. So there are a few things that happen in here where he looks at the house as almost a mathematical equation. And he breaks the gabled roof here. So to start with, that roof that we expect to come to a point and meet in the center doesn't. So that's one kind of first undermining of this particular norm of a house facade. Breaks apart the gable here. The chimney ends up taking up way more width than it needs to because it's not actually a chimney. It actually houses program inside of it and is a 3rd level. But then to kind of show you that he's playing, he makes a tiny little chimney right here. And the scale of that corresponds with the negative space scale of the hole in the roof. So this whole thing, clever. Otherwise, you would just assume that this is one big wide chimney, kind of the way Frank Lloyd Wright makes these big wide chimneys that are center anchors to the house. It's sort of a commentary on that notion. And then, as we look at this, the space where the door is meant to be has no door. It does have a door, but it doesn't have a visible door to us, and that's on purpose. So you actually enter the house kind of on the side here, but the door is not facing the front facade. It's actually facing this way. So the door's not facing the front facade. It just looks like a big void or kind of a negative space within this entrance where the door is supposed to go. Clever. The next thing he does is he treats the windows, so the symmetry that is in that kind of cartoon picture of a house has 2 equal windows on either side. And what he does is he puts 5 equal windows on either side here, 5 small squares on either side, but changes the relationship of how the window is organized. So here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little squares are organized in a row. You have a ribbon window there. And here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little squares are organized in one big window and one small window. So he's being playful about the idea of balance and symmetry. It's still balanced or mathematically balanced theoretically. You have the same amount of glass and the same amount of window space, but it's definitely not the same, and it's not symmetrical in the way that we would expect. The last thing he does here is make the house look incredibly flat, so you can't tell the roof apart from the kind of facade wall here. You don't see any break, which is one of those things that he's kind of referencing the cartoon image again for. So Venturi is particularly clever in how he thinks and how he thinks about architecture, and he does symbolize a kind of strong sentiment of architecture. A good postmodernist architect, Michael Graves, was a great postmodernist architect example. And also in Burbank, there's a very famous postmodernist architecture building, which is at the Disney lot. And it's the building with the 7 dwarfs, the kind of big cartoon dwarfs on top of it. This is supposed to be a postmodernist building because you can see the symbolism of those dwarves on the exterior of the building. So the building facade is telling a story. In that way, it's very literal. In this way, it's kind of cunning and sarcastic. But postmodern architecture is usually playing with references. And in this case, it's a reference to a kind of childhood image where here he's doing his own signature version of the childhood house, which of course is his house, not the ideal cartoon one. But often postmodern architecture is referencing something historical. Maybe it's a neoclassical building typology or an ancient Roman or ancient Greek building typology. Those are kind of things that postmodernism would reference. Okay. So the last strain of the architecture that we want to look at today for the 1960s discussion is paper architecture. And really, when I say paper architecture, I mean conceptual architecture and architecture that is pushing the boundaries, shocking and politically charged, motivated by a kind of youth culture and a sense of freedom maybe, or of wildness, that Archigram is pushing forward. Archigram is a group that comes out of London in the 60s. And actually, Peter Cook was one of the kind of leaders of Archigram, and he still teaches. He's still teaching. He actually taught me when I was in grad school, and he's a pretty wild old guy. But Archigram is one of the more famous examples of paper architecture and really capturing the spirit of the 1960s within architecture. So Venturi is almost the intellectual version of that, and Archigram is like the pop culture version of it. So here you can see Archigram really started, they went to architecture school. It's a group of students that banded together and put on an exhibit, kind of an art exhibit with an architectural mindset in an architecture gallery here. And it's a lot of collage and a lot of drawing. And it's not necessarily drawing in the architectural language, but it's using architectural drawings as a basis for the most part. So this image is collage and text. And you can see here that they're talking about kind of living in the city, communications. It says static communications. I think that says mobile communications. Verbal and nonverbal communication, signs, symbols, watch it happen, listen to the sound, see it flow. So this is an urban thinking mentality, the way they're thinking about this. This is another collage that is really bizarre, but I guess evidence of the work that they're doing, commenting on pop culture. So you see the little Coca-Cola sign, the Barbie dolls, the Superman in the background. This is the way that they're thinking about collaging. And so even this faceted like collage that exists here behind the Barbie, this is part of their work. Now, I don't think this holds as much weight as it did in the 60s. When you look at this now, it seems really a little deranged or something. But in the 60s, this was social commentary. It was really social commentary. And so then we get to kind of the more architectural Archigram work, which came later. So they had that kind of art-based exhibit in 63, and then later they developed, mostly Peter Cook developed these ideas about new cities. And so one of the cities he creates is called Plug-in City. This is 1964. And it's a city that is essentially modular. If you think about, what is that called? An erector set. Those little pieces of things that come together and you can make little toy cities out of it. This is how he's proposing that the city exists in this new place, in this realm. So we could all have a little piece of a city, or building, we should say, in a city that all connects to each other and plug into this grid. This is actually kind of how urban planning works, right? We're all in the electrical grid. We're all in the water system, the sewage, the phone lines even, but it's not visible, and it's not kind of visible to our eyes. I will say in the U.S., some of this stuff is visible. So like the phone lines and the power lines, we could see them, right? They're above ground. And I was recently having a conversation with a friend from Sweden who was really alarmed. And I mean, I just had actually never noticed it, but really alarmed about the fact that the power lines are above ground in the U.S. And oh my gosh, how antiquated and how unsafe. And why on earth would the U.S., such a rich, modern country, have power lines that are above ground? And I just had never stopped and thought about it. And then I was like, yeah, I guess that's kind of crazy. Anyway, so plug-in city, we do still live in a little bit of a plug-in city here. But this is a conceptual project again. So he's looking at making a city that has this kind of exoskeleton and kind of large personality that you see on the outside of the building. And again, you have a little texts here: move, happen, go. City is a network, go. A city is for happening. So there's this kind of psychedelic, groovy vibe going on in some of the collages, the clothing, the people, the little models and the girls that they have. In the drawings tell you kind of how they're conceiving architecture. And this doesn't look like cities as we know them or buildings as we know them. That's one of their kind of great strengths, is the way that they draw. They draw things that look architectural. They're using architectural kind of bird's eye view here. And they look architectural, but they're not actual building forms anyone can know or identify. So it kind of just gives you an overall feeling. It's an interesting subversive technique that they use. This is my favorite image of plug-in city, which shows us the grid as it exists in this. And this is really referencing things that are somewhat industrial, these kind of funnel shapes, which again don't exist or correspond with real world architecture. This stuff, which almost looks like mechanical parts, something based on engineering, that sits in here, also looks roughly architectural. You can sense scale because there are little people inside this structure, which is based on this diagrid. Structural support. Again, this all looks technical and thought through, and this is an architectural drawing, right? This is looks like a section that we're staring at, with things in the background and line weights, and the colors give it a kind of cartoony vibe. So Archigram influences a lot of architecture, even though this work never gets built, and they're really not suggesting that it would. They influence a lot of people who do end up building work, and even Peter Cook himself continues to try to build work. And he is slowly, even now, I believe he's in his 70s, just realizing some of these kind of wacky forms that he wanted to realize when he graduated school in the early 60s. But, it's taken him 50 years to get there. So that's the moral of the story here. But this is a zoomed in image of plug-in city, and little tiny little people here give you a sense of scale. These things almost look like shipping containers, these blue things as they stack together. The tubes are circulation, so you can see the person fits inside this little green tube, and that this becomes circulation. So the stuff here, as it all adds up, produces something that is architectural in nature, but we don't know what it is, and they never take the time to label it, right? It has no program beyond just being a city. And all the program that's implied is just implied. So the green circulation is what I gather based on the way that they're using people in the sections. And that's the color coding I think you're meant to take away from this, is like green equals circulation, blue equals something else that's program or storage or something. These almost look like smokestacks, or however you want to see it. But there's a sense that this connects with space, but it's not actual architecture. It's, I think, pretty smart, pretty brilliant. And then another member of Archigram named Ron Herron produced The Walking City, which was another conceptual city that's the kind of counterpart to Plug-in City. Ron Herron's Walking City is also very clever, maybe even more so. And he basically suggests that cities themselves are fixed to the ground. So this in the background is an antiquated city that is sitting on the ground and connected to the ground. And this crazy stuff in the foreground is his walking city. And the walking city is made of these blobs. You can just kind of see this blob. Here's another one, that blob. It looks anthropomorphic in nature, like a little critter or bug or something, with windows. So that's implying scale again. The windows give us some sense of scale, though not any true accurate sense. And the tentacle things that are sticking out of this, almost like telescoping legs, move. So whatever goes on inside this thing, you could almost think of it as like a cruise ship on little legs that move, walk around. So it says each walking unit houses not only a key element of the capital, but also a large population of world traveler workers. So traveler workers is a hybrid word there. These units move around. They move anywhere, and if you want to travel somewhere, you live inside this unit, and the unit slowly moves you from one place to the next. It's fun to think about, right? This is wacky and out there, and it's this city that's not tied to the ground, and it's not a ship. It doesn't move in the way we think of transportation, but it moves in this kind of slow, animalistic, anthropomorphic way that would be really destabilizing. If you think about the way cities work and the way government works, we vote in California. We live in California, right? We have a government here. We have a mayor here. This is a certain jurisdiction and part of the United States. It's not just a city that can go anywhere. Imagine if we could walk in this walking city to Mexico or to Canada, right? Then how could we call that California and say that it operates under California laws? This is part of the kind of subverse political agenda that goes on in this work, where it's not just architecture or a cartoon. They're thinking deeper about the social implications that would exist if this city were to kind of take off and walk somewhere else. Sort of a funny thought. These are more images. So it would have its own kind of nighttime nightscape, just as the regular city does, where all these little windows light up and indicate people are in there doing something alive. This building is one of the examples of Peter Cook realizing some of these funny shapes later in life. So this is in 2003. He builds a museum that is, or it's a concert hall and a museum, in Austria. And it's called Kunsthaus Graz, but it's in Graz in Austria. And it's nicknamed, everybody calls it the Friendly Alien, which is a very appropriate, very archigram term for this thing to actually exist. Peter Cook has a new firm that he calls CRAB, which is why that's what's listed here. That's the name of the firm, the acronym. But he has realized some of these ideas, but of course this thing doesn't get up and walk around. It's actually very tightly situated amongst these traditional buildings in Austria, which makes it look all the more silly and ridiculous next to these things. I think that's fun. It kind of gives it the power that it wanted to have all along here. So the Friendly Alien does exist in our society. Here's a better view. So you can see just how tightly it's kind of wedged into this very traditional European city. And these little tentacles that stick out, almost similar to the walking city legs, but these are skylights, and they let light in a directional manner into this blob-like shape. Okay, so a couple other theories that exist in the 60s have to deal with the cultural tendencies going on during this time. And another paper architecture group or conceptual architecture group is called Super Studio. And Super Studio makes a bunch of drawings. So using architectural methods, rendering techniques, these are hand-drawn drawings, mixing collage and kind of handwork, which I think is pretty beautiful. This is an image of the continuous monument, as they call it, an architectural model for total urbanization. This is from 1969. And again, this is like a city planning or town planning thing, but on a wacky scale that really takes over the globe. In this case, it's like a belt or something wrapping around the whole earth. And so when they say a continuous monument for total urbanization, they're talking about this building traipsing through and covering over the entire circumference of the earth and having one network that would cover the globe over the oceans, through land, through different cities. And so this is the space they make. They don't ever detail exactly goes on inside or what goes on inside or how this place actually connects to the earth. None of that stuff is detailed here, but it's just the concept in and of itself that you could create an enclosed city that would wrap the entire circumference of the earth. That's the concept, and that's the kind of mind-blowing concept that they want to portray. And some of the imagery here fits the kind of 1960s free love, hippie vibe. These people are enjoying hedonism, maybe enjoying each other's bodies and that bottle of wine and whatever those snacks are. and just hanging out. So this is the kind of point. These are young people. These are kind of almost student movements that are happening. These people are not students when they make this, but they had just finished school, and it's reflected in the kind of design and in the thinking. So these radical ideas are connected to the culture of the time. This is the continuous monument passing through Manhattan, with no deference to the city, right? It almost opens up a little hole for some of the buildings that they perceive as important, but otherwise, shoot right through the city of Manhattan, just takes over and continues and moves on. So, ideal kind of ideas that they're creating, different ideas of things. Another group out of Italy is called Archizoom, and they create something here, which is the no-stop city. Archizoom works with Super Studio. They both started around the same time in 1966, and they're both interested in the idea of kind of mega structures or city planning, urban planning, similar to Archigram. And this is meant to be a new proposal for an organization of the city, which doesn't rely on streets the way we think of streets, and doesn't use buildings lining streets. So the buildings are all organized on this loose grid. I wish I could zoom in here, but I kind of can't on this view. But you can see how the buildings are loosely creating a kind of dot, dot, dot or dashed grid in the landscape. And the little lines here are supposed to be evidence of new transportation systems. So if you think about a car, or a bus even. I guess a bus is a great example. These things move through the city on streets. But these little squiggly lines that they have here are supposed to be new ideas about transit that really maybe would be something that moves more like a snake and can weave anywhere through this city at any point, because the organization of the city is not based on streets, and these things can travel on the ground. So it's a concept, right? There is no vehicle that works in this little snake pattern, nor do they even propose to care to think of one. But the idea that this could work is really just clever and mind-blowing in and of itself. The fact that, sure, we could all just be buildings in a field, and then there could be this little snake transportation thing that moves through it and goes anywhere it wants at any time or any point. So, again, radical political notions that connect with this kind of cultural moment in the 1960s.